Welcome, everyone. We're just going to wait for everyone to join. As you're joining, in the chat box, just put your name and say where you're coming in from today. It'd be great to get a sense of who's coming along and which parts of the world you're coming in from. Chirag, you're very welcome from Brazil, London. Susan, you're very welcome. Costa Rica. Eric in Georgia, US. Tio in Brazil. Tiago in Brazil. Wow, that's a good mix already. Keep it going. Rome Butter in Bath, wonderful place. Sophie in Germany. Roberto in Italy. Jacobo in Colombia. Sultan in Saudi Arabia. Wow, we are getting a great list of people. This is a properly global audience. Fantastic. Right. Are we ready, everyone? Are we ready to go?
I believe we are, David.
All right. So welcome to the Strategy Tools Transformation Debate. It's absolutely fantastic that you're joining us today from so many different places and countries. We have some heavyweights in the mental and philosophical sense, not the physical sense, from the world of transformation. We have, at my rough calculation, more than 150 years of collective experience in forms of transformation, whether in academia, investors, entrepreneurs, board members, consultants, business leaders. And we want to share some of that wisdom today and importantly, learn from everyone joining as well. We started this debate actually in a program that Chris led on the Building the Transformational Company. This started as a private conversation. We enjoyed it so much, we thought, hey, let's try again. And so we have, and we've opened it up. Over the next 60 minutes, we want you to leave the session with some ideas, some tips, some stimuli in whatever role you play in transformation. You may be sponsoring it, you may be shaping it, running it, managing it, whatever you do. We want this to be useful to you. So let's get started. Let's ask the group here a question I hadn't anticipated asking, which is, in one word, how do you feel right now? Go on, off mute, Scott. Well, how do you feel right now? One word.
Excited.
Bill?
Let's refreshed.
Refreshed. Tyler?
Inspired.
Wonderful. Chris?
Globally connected. There's a dash in the middle. So globally connected.
Oh, very good. There's always a disruptor in the group. All right. So as we go through, get your comments and questions in the chat, and we'll definitely come to this. This is not just going to be a talking shop amongst us. But I'm going to start with a very, very simple question. What is transformation, and why, if there is such a term, why is it so difficult? Go on. What is it? Is it a buzzword? Is it understood? Give us a definition.
So can I, David?
You're very welcome.
Excuse me. I'm from New York. I don't do silence well.
Nor do I.
You know, I think there's a distribution, and I think that transformation is really the aspirational endpoint, the anchor of one of the points on the distribution. It's the far point. And for me, when we talk about serious transformation, it's really a major overhaul of probably business model and organizational culture in response to something going on outside of the organization.
That's good. I like that. Anyone want to complement with an E, not just an I, complement that definition with something new?
Yes, I would like to go and try and give it a try. So I think many of the academic definitions, they kind of talk about the change of the organization and the transformational structures. And I would like to kind of introduce the thinking about, thinking differently about value creation, which is more of kind of the way, business models and those types of things deal with the transformational aspect. So, and then I was also thinking about, is it about change in demand, or can companies actually transform from within without like an external shock affecting the organization? And I would say, that would also be a very interesting way to go. I think some companies actually do great transformation without external demand or shock taking place.
Great provocation. Scott, Chris, how do you respond?
I'll have a swing at this, David. So I would say poorly understood, increasingly important, and difficult to succeed. But we are starting to build a much better foundation of knowledge and playbooks and tools and frameworks case studies and faculty on this. So it is going to become much more commonplace, much more chances of being successful. And it's going to be just an integrated part of how we think about strategy, but it's difficult. That's the short version.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I just add to all of that, it's a change in the way that people work together internally and externally in the organization. So until that change takes place, I would argue it's not really transformation, it's movement in the direction, but it's when the people really start working together differently and they have that external internal communication paradigm shift that we have transformation. And as to what Chris said, that's why it's so difficult, because most of us don't want to change the way we work.
Yeah.
David, I'd just like to take issue with what Tala said about great transformation could occur without external shock. That may be possible, I think, but I think what we want to do always is encourage an outside-in type of mindset. That inside-out, raises the risk of getting it completely wrong or being oblique to what's happening in the world around us. So I think outside-in is, important to this conversation.
I agree. And I think as well as working together in new ways, to Scott's point, there is something about new mental models and new ways of thinking that may be about the customer, a greater focus on the customer needs from a product organization, or more of an ecosystem, lens versus industry. But as well as doing different things, I think there is something about a mindset shift at scale where people are thinking about their role, what they do day to day. And indeed, I think they think differently about the organization. I think often their relationship changes with the organization. If they're still there, often a lot of people get fired in transformations. Let's not forget that. So that's our starting point, everyone. That's our beginning point on transformation. Let's start getting some questions and comments going.
Well, David, let me shoot in one thing. I mean, there's one simple way of understanding it, really, and that is, have you officially killed your previous success, or have you killed your darlings? Because if the answer is, what do you mean, or no, then you're probably not transforming, you're just continuing and maybe just as well. And I think there was a piece in the Financial Times this morning that Audi announced that by 2026, they were going to discontinue the development of new combustible engine cars. And then some years later, probably around 2030, they were just going to completely stop touching even fossil fuel cars at all. Like, we don't even want to see them. So a transformation occurs when you can visibly and clearly say that we have killed our darlings, or we have discontinued a significant line of business, which for Audi would be, the entire shift away from fossil fuel or combustible engine cars. So I think that a key question is, have you killed your darlings? And that could be in the case of Netflix, your postal DVDs. In the case of Microsoft, it's the software bought and purchased in a box. But that's what we got to see. You got to go kill some of those your previous successes to really be able to call it a transformation.
I agree. What an elegant phrase you've used there. What an elegant phrase. Let's kill some. Yeah. No, I agree. And that's I think one of the sort of, what do you leave behind and when do you pull that is one of the riskiest parts of a transformation journey, for lots of reasons, in terms of customer reaction, in terms of, let alone just the financial headroom you need to invest in the new. We have a question. Let's just go to a question for a moment from Jacobo, which talks about, as digital transformation is the buzzword, does this somehow limit the scope of holistic transformation? I have a view on this, but I'm going to listen. So digital transformation, big buzzword. How does that relate to what we were discussing? Is it the same?
I would love to kind of start that discussion, if that's okay. I think that when you focus your digital transformation on just the digital, you're not doing what you're supposed to do. You should be focusing on your value creation, and the digital tools are tools to enable that value creation. So I think so in that way, more of a holistic perspective. I think many organizations, when they start to do digital, it takes some time, and then they figure out it's about the people, and then you start to come into the holistic kind of thinking again. So I think sometimes digital transformation is a little bit misinterpreted in terms of just being about the digital. Usually it's about the whole business model, which makes it more holistic. That's my point of view.
Everyone's nodding. All right.
Yes.
We,
That's
we
good.
have consensus. That's masterclass. Okay, we're going to move on then. So,
Well, David, let me fill in now. I've been
Here we go.
reading. You have no idea how much I've been preparing. I read the newspaper this morning, but there was a story around the digital transformation for Ford, right? So Ford, which is probably one of Bill's many favorite U.S.-based car manufacturers, Ford has a dealership go-to-market model. So most of their cars are sold to dealer or transferred to dealers and then sold to consumers. And there was an American buyer who was looking to buy a Mach-E, one of the new EVs that Ford's going to put out. And he went to the dealership, and basically the answer he got was that nobody in this dealership knows anything about electric vehicles. So thank you for showing up, but we're not able to help you. Would you like to buy a proper car instead? So when we talk about digital transformation for Ford, one of the things would be, well, should we transition away, like completely kill the dealership go-to-market channel and actually start implementing a direct-to-consumer similar to what Tesla has? And that would be an example of a digital transformation of a small part of the total holistic digital transformation. And Bill, I want to ask you this question. Based on buying preferences and the legacy of dealerships, what do you think the probability is of someone like Ford axing out the car dealership as a sales channel?
I think it's very unlikely. And so I think what's going to happen is that anything they do in what we would refer to as a transformational sense will be a partial transformation. It will be one small piece. I think that many organizations have to do that. Everybody has to juggle their present and their future. So I think one of the big questions to ask about a transformation without making judgment is, are you all in? Are we all in? Or is it going to be pieces of the business? And if it's pieces of the business, are we building a present to complement our future, which is generating the cash flow? And what are our obligations to the people who are in the present, soon to become the past?
That's a really good question, Bill. I think I just add, I feel a lot of the companies right now that are saying they're working on digital transformation, it reminds me of the late 90s when every company put .com in back of their name, because then they were an internet company. And so everyone was saying, oh yeah, we're .com. And I feel that the same thing is happening now with digital transformation. I think if transformation is about getting closer to your customers, then any of the intermediaries we're talking about are at risk of being eliminated or having their margins drastically reduced. And this is something that is going to have to be very carefully managed. But I've seen in several organizations now, transformation is being slowed down by channel conflict. And the risk is that someone that is not within the channel, they don't have those relationships or that legacy to protect. And so they're just going around it. And then what happens? The whole channel is at risk.
If I could jump in, Scott, a lot of what I see in digital transformation is merely the replacement of analog approaches. So it's not a transformation per se. It's a sort of a transition. But digital technology and the data it generates and the experiences it can create really opens up a whole bunch of business model opportunities that a real transformation might pursue.
I agree. And having led quite a number of digital transformations, the hardest bit is not the tech or the selection of the tech, which everyone focuses on, or indeed your role in, partnering with new companies, although that can be hard. It's the adoption and the behavioral change that follows from it. That's the hard. If you talk to the likes of Salesforce, Google, Microsoft, and so on, you say, well, what's your biggest challenge or one of your biggest challenges? It's not the product roadmap, and it will be the behavioral adoption of their products and how they sort of sell them in B2B. But let's just come back to the chat. I want to make sure everyone's involved in this stage. We talk about, well, Bill gave his answer, I think, to this question of what do you consider the greatest risk to successful transformation? We've touched on that in different guises. Is it the lack of coherence? Is it killing too early? Is it leaving people behind? Let's just go around. What do you think of it? I'll give you my answer at the end. What is the biggest risk?
So I'll start because of my phobia about silence.
You continue with that phobia, Bill.
My sense is the biggest risk if it is not following through, not completing it, not worrying about the details. So the really successful transformations that I've seen, few as they are, really have, they not only have big dreams about what they want to accomplish, but they have exquisite details to increase the likelihood that they will accomplish their dreams.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. I love that expression.
The biggest risk I would see is inertia. So there's this massive inertia in the organization, and there are people who know that they can, build this resistance and fight this, and they may even have a very rational reason for doing so. So if I'm in charge of a sales channel, I know that channel will be eliminated or will be reduced in importance, and I don't see a future career path for me, then I'm going to actively participate in this inertia. And that's the biggest risk, is how do we get this moving and keep it moving? Because there will be tremendous forces within the ecosystem that are going to come against us.
Tyler?
I can go. So I think there's like this, a transformational process. So you can fail in many of the different steps in terms of, getting a vision clear for the organization, and then more of the implementation, the incentives, the structures, and all of that. But if I were to summarize, I think that just communication from leadership and getting that message out to the organization, getting people to understand what it's about, I think that's really, really important, because that's about the mindset change of people. So at least in Norway, we've seen some great transformations, and I've talked to some of the leaders, and they say they use 50, 60, 70% of their time just communicating, over communicating,
yes.
to getting their organizations with them to understand what they are going to do, because a lot of people just look very narrowly on their own task, like you were discussing, Scott, is what is in it for me, right? So just trying to communicate and getting a common sense of what it's about, I think that's a key for transformations.
Great.
So David, I'll take a little bit different lens. So some of the work I'm doing right now, the biggest risk is actually not dealing with capital markets well enough. And that means different things for different organizations, but building on the assumptions that we're primarily talking about transformation of publicly listed companies, the capital markets is a big part of that sort of journey. And there was the Capital Markets Day for Equinor, one of our great Norwegian success stories to be. So they had Capital Market Day about a week ago, and all the newspaper was CEO does not have many Capital Markets Days left in him if he wishes to survive. Because the message that he delivered was, we are transforming, the energy industry is transforming, and we're going to shift capital from oil and gas projects, historically very profitable, good business, and we're going to shift them into not so good business, clean energy projects. It's going to be great. And all the analysts said, boo, and wiped 47 billion off market cap, share price down 7%. And basically, if that momentum continues, the board is going to get cold feet. Activist investors, including the prime minister, are going to give them a call and say, maybe we need to rethink this thing. So if you're not handling the external forces, namely capital markets, well enough, you can have the best internal cultural change you want. You're going to be dead in the water before you know it. And that's just my view.
That's a great story. It's very powerful. My taking your lateral theme, I'm going to go something that's a little bit, I'm not sure it's the greatest risk, but it's a feature I've seen personally, is where you have parallel organizations, which is linked to the inertia point that Scott referred to. You have an organization that talks a game of transformation, delivering aspects of transformation, and then frankly, the majority of the organization is saying, yes, I'm doing it and so on, but it's paying lip service to transformation, is still operating with old mindsets. And there comes moments where either it's the investor day or certain moments where it hits you, where you have parallel organizations and they don't kill what they need to kill, they don't really start. But there's a lot of theatre involved in transformation as well, I observe in board meetings and so on. And the question, I remember I interviewed my old boss, Kevin Ellis, who's the CEO of PwC, or a good chunk of PwC. And he said in his communication, to your point, Tyler, he spends a lot of time communicating. He said, I'm always thinking about the person in the room who's the sort of, who is the most worried or the most fragile, and can I convey the message clearly to them? You can't always appease them, but you can actually that's the test, not somebody who's necessarily a peer. But let me just go back to the chat. We've got some great points coming in here. We say that, Peter Boone says, perhaps one of the biggest risks is not understanding this journey takes 10 years or more. It is a long haul. So there's often people get distracted and bored and so forth. And not understanding, Gary, the impact of transformational change on the organization. Yeah, it's a brutal process. There's a huge amount of change fatigue and so forth. Now, we've just gone through, depending on where you live, and I'm conscious we come from different countries around the world. We're coming through, I hope, the pandemic into a new place and still facing major systemic issues. My proposition to you is actually that's increased the need for transformation in the way we've described. Economy's tough, competitive landscape is different. People in organizations, I think, are more expectant of their leaders. And indeed, the investors, I think, will become increasingly impatient. Do you agree or not?
Can I give a brief comment? Is it okay, Scott? Sorry. No, I was just thinking, I was picking up on Bill's point earlier about, the demand side, and then Christian's point about the investor side in terms of transformations. And I think right now there's this kind of need for both proactivity and reactivity. So we have kind of reactivity from the pandemic, but then at the same time, you need to be proactive in terms of how to deal with it, because we've never dealt with it before. We don't have the game plan for that kind of outcome. So there's this kind of balance between reaction and proactive behavior, because we need to create now, the demand side market is not yet telling us what we're supposed to become. So there's this kind of imagination that needs to take place to establish what will come after the pandemic, which is not totally reactive. It's also very proactive. So it's just some thoughts I had related to what Bill said earlier.
Right, yeah. Very different skill sets. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to yield to Scott. Go.
No, Bill, you go ahead. I'll go after you.
No, really quickly.
That's the last time we do that, guys, by the way. You just get in there. Scott, go ahead.
The reason I said no is I think 6 or 9 months ago, people were actually recognizing that things needed to change and there was a willingness to change. And now there are a lot of things, information pieces coming that actually we may be able to return some of our models to the way they were. So we see a number of companies saying everybody's back in the office September 1st. We see a number of oil companies saying, I told you, oil's $100 a barrel again. We're making way more money than a renewables company ever could. And so there is this counter balance that's swinging. I think actually we were in an easier place for transformation 6-9 months ago than we are today, where people's mindsets now are starting to harden again. And that's going to be an extra challenge, because if I see all my competitors with better returns than what I'm able to deliver, and I'm saying, well, hang on, in 4 years, I'm going to be better. Is there going to be the patience to wait, whether that's a quoted company or a family office company? And this is where, back to the communication point, it's going to take very strong leaders that can convince investors, boards, external stakeholders that actually the direction is going this way. Because an oil company today would have a very strong argument that $100 oil makes a lot more sense than finding a place to put renewables.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with that. I think that the pandemic was the unthinkable. We would never have thought that the global economy, our societies would have shut down for almost a year. Last year, this time we were still in denial, and we've now been through a year of it. My sense is that this is never going to end. That the virus is not conquered. It will mutate into forms to come back so that it'll be a chronic problem. So much of the way in which we think about organizational life is episodic. We have projects, we have deadlines, we have, calendar-driven reports. But I think this is continuous. So I think what we're going to see is a period of confusion. For me, what Scott described is that period of confusion, a lot of pressure to return to the normal, but the normal is gone, I think. I think historically, we'll look back and say, we'll never do it that way again. And so I think one of the things that's our challenge at the moment is to try to move our organizations forward in a period that we're unprepared for, and where there are many different points of view as to how we should return. But I think that believing that we can return to the familiar is very dangerous in terms of work, in terms of customer engagement, in terms of technology, all of those sorts of things.
I just want to follow up on that, Bill, and say I fully concur. I mean, a lot of my business school conversations are about when do we go back to normal, and we gently suggest that let's talk about a couple of years or more. So I'm totally with you on that. I want to go back to something Scott said, and I'm going to introduce the word panic-induced transformation efforts. I'll probably figure the rest out later. But we have seen during the pandemic that there have been companies that's like, oh my God, we need to transform and let's hurry up, and there's a pandemic and we don't know what to do about it. But I think that whenever you have a panic-induced transformation effort, it's super shallow. The board is not aligned. The investors are not aligned. So you run the risk of even having a little bit of headwind and it's just going to collapse. And I think that some of the efforts that we've been seeing, recently have been largely panic-induced. So the chances of a successful journey outcome is slim to none.
The one thing, I agree with that. The one thing that I've been disappointed by, it sounds very grand, doesn't it? Disappointed by is the pronouncements of leaders, not just on working from, back to work, brackets the office, but just that hardening that Scott referred to. And yet we've seen great moments of genuine compassion for people as well as professionals, which, and frankly, I'm not seeing enough evidence of actually the same traits of leaders continuing, or I've seen some the opposite, which frankly, if you're trying to transform an organization, if you don't understand, the hearts, minds, of the people you're trying to convince, you haven't got a chance. And yet I do think for some leaders, they sort of, particularly in, some of the financial services industry, the banks, some of the consultancies, they sort of think, we've done that now. Now we can get back to this sort of more mercenary hero type of leadership model. But I want to just change the rhythm just for a moment. And we're going to do some short, sharp questions. We're not going to go through each five, but we've got a lot of questions coming in from the group, so which is fantastic. In no particular, if I get the wrong order, don't think anything bad of me. But I'm curious about one question. The board of directors, what is the role that they should play in a transformation in a nutshell? What's their role? What should they do and what shouldn't they do?
Well, they should be actively involved, hands-on in the process, exploring the edges and really getting into it. What do you think, Bill?
Yeah, I think they should be encouraging big risks at this point in time. I think they should be supporting the really rethinking of the business model, the organization, all of those sorts of elements.
And I think they need to also show in their own behaviors and words how they are changing and rethinking and communicating that well, because that sets the right conditions for others. Julian Gorniak asks, how do you and the panel deal with vested interests at the executive level that can often get in the way of transformation? I'm quite ruthless on this, which is, I think very early on and throughout, if somebody in the exec team does not get it, does not want to invest in their own learning, experimentation, and is not with it, they can't stay long. Now, that doesn't mean you do it overnight, but there is something about a belief. Do you have a shared belief? Do you have a shared sense of willingness to learn? If you don't, I think there are minimum conditions that if you don't deal with that quite ruthlessly, and that may take longer. I know one tech company I worked with, that could take 6 months to a year because that person had a lot of following in the organization. But there are ways to sort of gently minimize their impact over time before they have to be moved out. I'm quite ruthless on that.
I think it also depends on what the business is going to be in the future, because that person, their vested interest may be just what's best for that business unit.
Yes.
But if the business unit is going in a different direction than the business, you're better to carve it out or sell it or move it, because it could be a very good standalone business that just doesn't fit in what you're working on. I have a very specific example. I was working with an organization and they were transforming into a business focused on sustainability. but they had a part of the business which was very profitable that was the opposite of sustainability. And what they did is they sold that. And they took that money and they were able to use that to invest heavily in sustainability. Now, the person who is running that business unit, they're still there today as the president. And they run, I mean, if you like that business, it is a great business. If you don't, then you need to get rid of it. But that's part of, why is someone against what you're working on? It may be because their part of the business doesn't fit in what you're doing for the future. I think it's an important question to ask.
David, one of the things when we talk about transformation, we spend a lot of time on business model, probably less time on culture. This is reality, not what I think should be. And almost no time at all on leadership and leaders changing behaviors. That's implicit. We leave that up to individuals to think about that on their own and define how they're going to change. And I think we need to make those changes much more explicit, probably in all three dimensions.
I couldn't agree more. Tyler, on the point about communication you made, Sophie makes a good point around how do you move the crowd. Transformation is not just the board, the exec team. You need to move the crowd and engage and communicate with them, whether you or anybody else. Any views and examples of how do you do it? How do you mobilize the crowd? What is it that it takes?
I think that's like that. If you were to give a one-line answer on that, I think it would be really rich. I think that's what all organizations really struggle with. And there's always the talk about, the 1/3 that wants to go right ahead, the 1/3 that, stays a little bit behind. You can convince them and then you kind of communicate. And then there's maybe 1/3 of the organization where it's much harder. And a lot of organizations discuss whether or not to invest in the front runners or whether to invest in those that are not willing starting out and, use a lot of resources on them. And I think that it might be different across organizations, but it could also be good for the organizations to have some front runners kind of show, not tell, kind of people who shows how things can be done, or business units, and that can also help the organization transform. Or you can think that you need to have everybody on the same level and then we go. I don't think that's that might not be a good investment, but I know that's a big discussion among leaders doing and working.
One thing I'd say just briefly on that is that there's a lot around cascading communication, right? And that's important. But I think it's more, which is, I do believe, and I've seen in a few media companies I've worked with, the opportunity to involve people in the development process, not just in, crowdsourcing ideas or hackathons and so on, but genuine development of the business. And it's a mindset shift, which is not there's somebody at the top who's going to design something and at the right stage, I'm going to go and ask you for views. It's like, I think there is a collection of people, maybe not everyone, but a large collection of people at different stages of the development, whatever it is, new product, service, business, culture, can and should be involved. I think to build upon our leaders, that's a big shift in leadership mindset. And it comes with a discipline of practice to say, that's a norm. A level of participation is a norm, not just sort of before we roll it out or before an investor day, to Chris's point.
I comment very briefly. Sorry, Bill, because I just want to comment on that. But it's important because when you look at successful transformation, there's like the bottom up and the top down, and both have to be in place. You cannot build a transformation on a top down type of thinking. I think that's really, really hard, and it demands so much communication and a really aligned organization. But you need to do the bottom up and the kind of those front runners and pioneers that want to do it, especially for digital. But I'm fascinated then by Bill's point earlier, when you have this parallel organization, that's what Kotter kind of suggests that we do for the organization. Keep the hierarchy in place and then add this kind of network type of organization. But some of you were discussing earlier that that's also very difficult. So it's this kind of, you want to do the dual thing that you're kind of discussing now. You want to do engagement, involvement, and at the same time you want to keep some control from the top. But that's kind of the messy part of the transformation as I see it, and also in terms of communication. Sorry for that.
David, could I jump in on this? This is going to reek of selection bias from the organizations I'm working with, but my answer would be unorganized, not disorganized and not decentralized, but unorganized. Essentially, create more autonomy and more responsibility throughout the organization, and come up with a very different organizational format than is prevalent at the moment.
with bounds, right? Bounds in terms of, you know, expectations. So it's not completely, they know what to expect. To your example of hire, there are very clear expectations on returns, how people, you know, sort of standards, but you give them genuine autonomy and genuine empowerment, right?
Yes, and also some guiding principles that act as a compass to help them assume this new responsibility, and make it, you know, people want to join this or not, that's up to them. But I think that unorganizing is you know, we've used the word alignment a lot this morning, and my time, and it seems to me that maybe alignment is a you know, a legacy term. Maybe we want not alignment, but, you know, some sort of I don't know, agreement. I don't know what the word would be, but not something as
The alignment
direct.
still feels like a very managerial.
Yes, we're all moving in the same direction at the same time at the same speed.
Yeah, Chris, you've advised lots of companies in this space. You've run lots of programs successfully in this, you know, simulations and so on. What is if you had to sort of characterize one or two capabilities of the people leading transformation, what would you draw out from your experience?
I'll give you three domains, and I'm going to use that to pass it back to Bill for a second. I would say strategic thinking, strategic mindset, and that's something that we've seen in the simulations. If you have a management team going through the transform simulation really, really quickly, we identify those that have a strategic mindset and the ones that don't. It just stands out, like boom. The second is curiosity. Are we genuinely curious about these new areas? Yes or no? Because a lot of the people that I work with, they're maybe not as curious as they could have been. So they're quite judgmental too soon, too early. And then it becomes kind of a tough one. And the third one is the ability to learn, which is a function of curiosity. And Bill, we've been talking about DSM, but it's been years ago, really.
Yes.
So one of my favorite books on transformation is a not a widely read book. It's called From Coal to Biotech: The Transformation of DSM with Business School Support. And DSM used to be the Dutch state mine, so the national coal company of the Netherlands. And they have done 5 transformation cycles, currently ending up as a biotech company. And this book really lays out the role that IMD played in working with, training, supporting, facilitating, teaching hundreds of managers over 25 years. Bill, what's your view on the DSM-IMD relationship and how the business school plays into a successful transformation journey?
So I was part of that, and I think that, and I agree with you. I shared. I've lost touch with DSM since I've moved, but I share your respect for what they did. You know what was interesting they had a lot of expertise groups, at least in the innovation area. They had an expertise group that helped different parts of the business transform. So they had they left the choices, the transformational choices, up to the business unit managers, but with a lot of collaboration inside the organization with their own R&D expertise domain. And then they relied on outside groups, IMD being one of them, maybe the principal one, to help put that in, to facilitate that sort of conversation. And I think it worked really well. And curiosity and imagination, their CEO at the time was extremely, one of the I thought one of the most impressive CEOs. He was curious, he was imaginative, and yet he held them to some fairly strict business model expectations.
Just a question on all those examples. A lot of the examples to date that we've been given are, I'm going to be a little bit provocative now. It's that time of the day where we need to just, wake up. They're sort of modernization. Many of them are modernization examples, catching up to the realities. You wrote earlier, Bill, on analog to digital. They're sort of catching up to the expectations of their customers and all their other stakeholders. Is that how we think about transformation, i.e. a legacy incumbent traditional organization? Or if you looked at some of the superstars that we would talk about and read about all the time, do they still have the need for transformation? We've heard of examples recently in the New York Times of, former Google people being a bit frustrated with some of the leadership there. And indeed, I ran a session a couple of years ago with a mid to senior Google person who she said, yes, we're very bureaucratic. It was like a mic drop moment in a group of consultants. Like, wow, if you think about that, you being bureaucratic, have a look at us. But I won't talk about my former employer anymore. So is transformation a modernization story, or is it more? Is it more for sort of people who are already doing well, who want to go to the extraordinary?
I think it's on that distribution, right? Modernization is on that distribution that we spoke about earlier. But the really impressive ones are the ones that really transform. Tali used the word mindset, transform the mindsets of people, really open up opportunities rather than make them more digital, more modern, what have you. But really, I think, rethink, who are we? What is the business that we're in reverse order, right? What's going on around us? Who do we want to be? How are we going to get there? It's more profound.
Okay.
Just a comment. So I sometimes compare it with disruptions. Like you can have transformations or disruptions, which I think of as more new companies coming into an area or a sector, whereas the transformation deals with kind of existing incumbents changing to become or take the opportunities that disruptors could take. But I don't know if people have different points of view of that. But so if you're asking what type of organizations do transformations, I would say it's more incumbent than traditional companies trying to change their value proposition, business model to cater to customers. Or I would also include, as you did now, David, other types of stakeholders, because I think we need to think more about transformation in ecosystems than just meeting the customer when we take this kind of sustainability point of view on organizations. Then I think they meet a lot of other stakeholders where we also need to think about how to transform relative to them.
I'll pick up on that, and I'll pass the question over to Scott. So I think for big companies, disruption is something that happens to you. Like you get hit by a car and it happens. It's very unfortunate. And transformation is something that you do, something that you can proactively do and shape. But Scott, I have a question coming here. So as we're discussing, I would suggest if big companies could transform, we wouldn't have unicorns. And Scott, I'm going to pass this over to you and say, how would you see this? Because if big companies could transform quickly, we wouldn't have companies with the likes of Klarna and Coinbase and all of these very fast-growing, successful fintech startups, because the banks would have done it themselves. What do you think, Scott? Unicorns transformation, can big companies transform?
So 2 points. One, obviously, there's a lot of capital that apparently is chasing very few opportunities right now, or very few perceived opportunities, because we keep getting these larger and larger valuations that in some cases may be difficult to reconcile over time. And then the question comes back to, Klarna, the Sears robot card was doing that 100 years ago, and they were doing it really, really, really well, where you could walk into the shop and buy anything on credit, and you would pay it over months or years, depending on the purchase, with a revolving credit plan, which is essentially what Klarna has done. They've just put it online instead of in a store. But why are big companies not doing this? Why is Deutsche Bank not Klarna, etc.? And I think that's a question that people need to look at the mirror and ask is, have we set our rules and compliance and structure to a level where there is zero freedom to take risk or to move? We were with one of the large banks, and we thought it was so remarkable on the, you have those little paper table plate things you put on when you walk into the cafeteria, and there are things written on them. And it was a list of all the things in compliance that you could get fired for if you violated them. And we were with the CEO of the bank, and we said, is this a joke? I mean, are you kidding? And they said, no, we need to do that because there's these rules and we've had a lot of problems.
And a lot of them are made up. A lot of these rules are actually not real. They're just history, aren't they? Yeah.
They are. There's a problem that happened, and so we had a rule to replace it.
Yeah.
And you can see that in big companies where you get these larger and larger series of committees. And you know that every committee, there's a story behind why that happened. And it was probably an anecdotal story. But of course, we're not going to have companies being willing to transform if we're looking at just a rule-based system. We need to have some ability for risk-taking and not only experiments, because I think most companies you can experiment in, but there needs to be systematic ways that you can take risk and that the organization learns from it. And of course, smaller companies are much better doing that than larger companies. And Chris, that's why I think we see more money going to Klarna than we do to Deutsche Bank, or why Stripe has a higher valuation than JP Morgan Chase. And that's why.
So that's a brilliant answer. We're gonna have a quick fire round now, and then we're going to go back to some of the comments. I'm conscious we've got some brilliant comments, and I'd invite my panelists to go through those. But I'm going to give you some choices, some short choices, and you probably need both of these if you're going to be leading transformation, but you have to choose one. This is just like an interval, like a little bit of a sort of aperitif, if you like, before the meal. So, Bill, when it comes to strategy, imagination or analysis?
Imagination.
Tala, when it comes to transformation, do you think of strategy or do you think of innovation?
I stay with strategy.
Chris, foresight or pragmatism?
Pragmatism.
And Scott, trade-offs or paradoxes?
Paradoxes.
Okay. I'm just going to leave those those hanging there, just to sort of see how it goes. Right. So we got some great. That's what I do sometimes, some lateral sort of stuff. So I want to go to any particular comments, everyone, that you've seen. I'm going to have a look through them as well as we're going through that. Any particular comments you thought were interesting? I had one which was, I think, from Roberto, which is, to what degree does I'm doing it from memory now, to what degree does the nature of the transformation change by, if you like, where it comes from? If you like, the driving force? Could be the board, could be the investors, external investors. How much does that change the scope, the nature, the dynamics of the transformation journey? Is it the same process?
No, I think it's not the same process, and I think but I do think that you don't want to. You don't want top management not involved. I mean, top management has got to set the tone. It's got to give the authorization to do this. I mean, it can't be all bottom up. But I really think that in most of the transformations I'm looking at that seem to be working, top management shares decision making, really changes the locus of where decision making takes place, and then plays a different role than they have in the past. They're cheerleaders, they're protectors, they're enlargers, but there's a different level of the organization involved, and there's and different roles. And I think that's really difficult to do if you start bottom up. So I think you really need to start top down in that respect.
Mm-hmm. I love the fact in the chat, by the way, there are conversations going on between us. They don't need us as a panel. That's fantastic. That's how it should be.
That's giving up responsibility.
Yeah. It's practicing what you're preaching there, Bill. There is a question which I'm going to probably crudely summarize from Junior, which, so forgive me, around complexity. I mean, transformations are genuinely complex of the scale of organizations. How do you, if you're a leader in some shape or form of transformation, how do you both deal with that complexity and understand it externally, internally, and all the dynamics, but also keep it really simple? To Tyler's point earlier about how do you then communicate it? What are the practices you've seen of people who've managed the complexity but kept things really simple at certain stages? What do they do? Any practices, mindsets, behaviors?
Just one thing. Bill, you go.
No.
No, I kind of like the kind of thinking about the first order, third, the level of complexity you get to understand. First of all, it's about the mindset and understanding, you know, it's a first order, second order, third order. How far can you go in terms of understanding the complexity? I think that's really dangerous if you don't go out that route first and kind of try to figure out what are the real complexities. And then you need to reduce and make some of it redundant. And then you need to make hard choices. And to the point earlier about bottom-up transformations, I think one of the problems with bottom-up transformations is that when the organization starts to go, there's so many initiatives that you need to start prioritizing. You need to be really hard in terms of your prioritizations. Otherwise, you kind of run wild on the new things bubbling up in the organization. And that's also a type of complexity. So I think making these decisions, understanding the complexity, and then being able to kind of reduce like in different processes, I think that's one way of getting at it.
Great point. Okay.
I think you move before you have to. I think that transformation should be regarded as a never-ending phenomenon. We're going to be changing all the time. We're no longer going to be episodic. We're going to be continuous in the way we change. And then I think you change before it's contextual. You change before the industry has to change. You change when resources are abundant and people feel good about themselves. You don't wait to get to panic-induced transformation efforts, you know, or the burning platform when resources are scarce and people are afraid.
We've talked about critical moments on the transformation journey, and that's something that featured in the program that we were all part of. Whether in all your experience or a specific example, what would you call out as the critical moment of a transformation, or a critical set of moments that sort of frankly make or break it? We alluded to this earlier, but I want to get quite practical and real, because there are people on this call who are probably in transformations in some shape or form. It's like, okay, what do we disproportionately need to focus on to make sure we get it or these things right? What would you say?
I'll kick off with capital market days, David. I mean, I can't emphasize this enough. When you look
You've got to be in your bonnet about that, haven't you? This is your thing.
It's because it's completely underrated. I mean, if you don't get it right, you know, it's just going to completely pull the carpet under your feet. And I'm seeing a lot of companies that don't spend enough time really creating the narrative, creating the new version that they want to build. And if you're looking at, for example, and again, we'll take the automotive industry. It's not about selling a different car. So we used to sell a combustible engine car, now we're going to sell an electric vehicle car. The fundamental economics behind each car sold is very, very different. So you need a story to go with that shift. And if you don't get that, you know, every major car company is just going to get slaughtered on in the capital markets. So the crunch time, you know, the NBA finals, the final shot is happening in your capital markets day, and then everything else is just details. Boom, right there.
Okay.
Well,
I agreed with everything you said there, apart from the last comment. But anyway, go on, Scott.
So building off what Chris said, and also looking at private companies, not just quoted companies, it's the moment when there's a difficult decision on resource allocation and it goes to the new business. So you'll often see this where a leader will stand up and say, we need to transform, and it's our number one priority. And then you'll see 6 months later, the key talent has been allocated to the core legacy business, or the resources have been allocated to the core legacy business. I think the crunch moment is when you have to make that decision and someone says, you know what, we're going to stop selling CDs and boxes. That business is dead. You know what, we're going to sell off our computer business. That is what we were known for our 100-year history. You know what, we're going to stop flying airplanes around the world because we're a technology company now. That's the moment when it really happens. Until then, no one believes it. And I think the car companies are not there yet. Most of them are still working on dealerships and outdated models of extended warranties. They haven't confronted what mobility will mean. Some have, but there are some that have a long way to go still.
Okay. I had a thought on, I spent some time with Jeremy Darroch, who's the CEO of Sky, now part of Comcast, so I believe, and I think is a transformational leader. I know a few of the audience who sort of work for that organization. In critical moments when people were saying they were peaking, you know, 10 million subscribers and so on, having heard him and spent some time privately with him, I think he was great at articulating the need for change in ways that are both strategic and personal, and actually embedding in his management and executive team and below a mindset and a framework which was all about, to the earlier point, priorities, choices, ultimately customers. They always talked about the same things. It was I'd be provocative here, somewhat a bit robotic sometimes. There was a language and a mindset of how they thought about how they built the business. So the critical moment was, one is doing it consistently, time and time and time again, that actually becomes second nature and people start playing it back to you in their own ways. Anything else?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about the moments of truth in marketing, right? So it kind of comes back to Scott's point about when the hard decision needs to be made, then the right decision has to be made. And if that doesn't happen, it could all falter. People don't believe it anymore. And then you go back to your capital markets, Christian, and nobody, believes that this is an actual transformation. It's more for show. And I think a lot of companies try to do these things for legitimacy. In digitalization, we see it a lot. A lot of people, a lot of organizations undertake technology, but it's not a real transformation. It's more a legitimacy play, maybe for the capital markets as well, and that could be temporary, but on the longer term it kind of falters. So
Great point. Bill, did you want to come in?
Well, I was just 2 weeks ago, Ferrari chose a semiconductor executive to be the new CEO. That struck me as being, a very vivid change, and board initiated or family initiated change but now that may not be the moment if that individual can't create a compelling story around change.
I agree.
And then I want to come back to Christian. I think Christian was trying to challenge us a little bit that it's all about the capital markets. I think it's also then about the people and the culture of the organization actually changing as a result of a new CEO coming, trying to do new things. So if you don't have all of that with you, I don't think the capital markets are convinced either. So
the other thing I'd say is that curiosity point, which some people say it's a bit glib, but I've seen lots of successful transformation programs in one sense doing, meeting the milestones, delivering value, but their context is slowly changing. And the leaders are not spending enough time at the edges of the organization because they've got a plan, they're delivering it. Actually, things are going pretty well, but actually there are some weak signals of change. And actually they've got back into that rhythm of, yes, some responsibility and distributed responsibility, but it becomes business as usual. And they're not thinking differently and thinking about the outside world enough. I've seen that quite regularly. Right, we 3 minutes to go. We've had some brilliant comments. I'm grateful to my colleagues for answering them and keeping going on each of those. Final remarks. What would you encourage the participants to think about or do differently when it comes to transformation? A sentence or two each. Chris, you go first.
I will give them a reading list with all of David Lancefield's recent writings and the book called Strategic Transformation, Changing While Winning. And of course, also everything that Bill ever wrote, which is so summer reading, get out there and enjoy those books because there's a lot of good stuff from David and from Bill that's really worth reading.
You're in a very generous mood today, Chris. Oh, wonderful. Let's keep doing these sessions.
But we shall.
Scott, you go ahead before I get my blushes.
Yeah, whether you're a board member, a CEO, a manager, or a consultant, ask more questions and listen more to the answers. So a lot of transformation, the answer is there already. It's just nobody wants to hear it and no one wants to ask that difficult question. And so do it. What's the worst that can happen? You get fired, right?
Tyler?
I'm going to go back to my communication point and think a lot about the stories you tell the organization, making it simple enough for people to understand, and also maybe include something that we haven't been talking too much about, the emotional side of the organization, like get people involved and motivated, not only functionally, but also emotionally.
Yes. I'm going to leave the last word to Bill, but I'm going to give my quick comment would be, there's a lot of process necessary in transformation. Structure helps. There's a lot of effort, a lot of grit and resilience. But this is about shifting mindsets. And I think there's a lot more effort that could go in terms of how you can encourage people to think differently. And to the exchange between David and Junior, I think if some people don't get that and they are in influential roles, they need to be helped, coached, supported, or if that doesn't happen, moved out, because they're a big drag on the organization. Bill, final word to you.
So I would pay attention to the competitive context, because I believe everything starts outside in. I would dream big in responding to that. Foresight, try to think about what's coming in the future, not aiming at the present target, but where you think the future target's going to be, and then details. The other thing is trust your people. You trust your people, unorganized.
I have to say, this has been a fun, enriching, stimulating, just really enjoyable conversation. And I'm really grateful for all the participants, the quality of comments, questions, and I look forward to reading all those. I hope we've done our best to sort of respond to those as we go. You can see in the chat, if you've enjoyed this, actually, there are some programs that we've all enjoyed or played a part in, whether it's the Building a Transformational Company, the simulation that comes with that, the Transformational Leadership Masterclass. And if there's other comments, questions, or things, just reach out to all of us. And thank you. That was, for me, and I mean this sincerely, transformation in terms of how I feel and think. So let's on to the next one. Thank you, everyone, and have a great morning, afternoon.
We have a closing comment here, David. Someone suggested we should do this for a 6 hour. So I think when we do round number 2, we're going to open for 6 hours, and people can come in the morning and come back in the afternoon, and we'll get the most out of everyone. But thank you very much.
We'll have to see whether there's customer need for that, to Bill's point, but why not? Thank you, Chris, and thank you, everyone.
David, thank you very much.
Thank you,
David.
everyone.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.